Hello and welcome to our session on how some of the world's top cities fare for working women. I'm Ruth David, Bloomberg's Deputy London Bureau Chief and Senior Reporter. Joining me is Rosalia Vazquez, who's Econometrician and Wage Specialist at the International Labour Organization. Rosalia, thank you so much for chatting with us. I would like to start with one of the problems that we found in ranking some of these top cities was the absence of good data. Data is something you are very, very familiar with. You also highlighted in our conversations that sometimes the data does not capture all the facts, like with our cities of Singapore, Dubai, and Hong Kong. Could you talk a little bit about what you have seen on the treatment of women in these cities?
So thank you very much for having me here. Yes, that is the case. You asked two questions. Let me see if I can answer the first one. Data usually is, when we say data is labor force surveys, usually are representative of the population. And if labor force surveys are done in a way that they capture the working population, then we will have a good representation of the whole wage distribution and therefore be able to estimate gender pay gaps or gender inequality in general. But sometimes in some countries, particularly in city-states, the ones that you've mentioned, the labor force is not necessarily going to be fully captured by this type of surveys because, for example, they usually may target households in the population, but these are households that are registered, and the households may not necessarily provide data on those people who work for them, for example, domestic workers. And these domestic workers are part of the labor force, but are not captured because surveys are not designed to capture them in these particular cities. In the rest of the world, that may also happen. You may actually interview a household where the woman lives in the household and works as domestic workers outside her household. But you may not necessarily capture women who are living domestic workers when the household is surveyed because the people in the household don't perceive these people as being part of the household or the labor force. So sometimes what you find is that women who are more likely than men to be at the low end of the wage distribution, you actually don't necessarily capture them because they are working in sectors that labor force surveys don't necessarily have a good representation of these sectors. Whereas in the case of men, they're more likely to work in sectors that are well captured by labor force surveys. So this is the problem that we have in city-states like Dubai, in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, etc., where you have a significant proportion of women who work in the labor market as domestic workers and who are not necessarily captured by these surveys. So what we end up is with an estimate of the gender pay gap that is potentially, let's say, a downward estimate of the reality that goes on in the country.
And gender pay gap was something that we saw across the board in all of the cities that we surveyed. Some cities, it was way more than the others. For instance, in Tokyo, it was really high, but in places like London and maybe even Germany, where they've made it mandatory to report on the wage gap, or they're encouraging companies to do that, you get to see it more. How much do you think the laws and quotas help to reduce the gender pay gap, and what are you seeing around that now?
Okay, so at the moment, what we have estimated at the International Labour Organization is that the gender pay gap across the world, on a weighted average, taking into account the size of countries, is about 20%. Now, that was a pre-COVID estimate, so we don't know exactly what's going on now and how it will have changed after the COVID pandemic. But what we do see is that in countries where you have not just the legal system that punishes gender inequality in the world of work, in the workplace, but the instruments to make these legal frameworks work, in these countries, it is likely the case that the gender pay gap is either less or it will be reduced in the future, because these are countries that have put in place elements very recently. So we still have to see how over time these elements work. But for example, the one you mentioned, Germany, Germany is a country where a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, they decided to actually make enterprises have compulsory audits. If you are a work employee, a wage employee in Germany, and you think as a woman or as a man that in your enterprise you are being discriminated and other people who have a similar function than you are getting paid more than you have the right to have wages disclosed to you by this enterprise. These are for enterprises of more than 250 wage employees. You have other countries where similar rules apply. For example, in the case of Switzerland, very recently, for enterprises that are higher than 50 wage employees, what you have is that you have to have a gender audit if you want public procurement. So if you want to have access to public procurement, you have to show that your enterprise does not discriminate in terms of wages and that you are auditing your enterprise in terms of gender equality. And that will give you access to that procurement. You can actually have this auditing going on. If there is any problem spotted, that you can actually do something to reduce the gender pay gap. And that actually will potentially have an impact. What is the impact? We don't know yet, because we need a few years for us to collect data and to see how the impact of this legal system has actually changed. Then what we also observe is that in countries where you have effective minimum wages, that's what goes on at the low end of the wage distribution, that there is a legal floor, then, and of course this works, it means that there is compliance with the minimum wage system, then the gender pay gap is much lower at the low end. And it is at the low end where you have a significant fraction of women working in the labor market. So in these countries, the wage gap is usually something that is defined at the upper end, where there is far more discretionary wage determination processes going on.
And are the cities, in your experience, usually a reflection of the countries? Because in a lot of the data that we've used country data as the cities being represented there. Is that what you have found as well?
We don't usually work on a city level. That's because it's very rare to find data that is representative at city level. What we do is we estimate at country level. One thing that it can be said is that the workforce in a city can never, it's not usually the case that is the same as in a rural area or in the rest of the country. And some cities are very specific. You concentrate a significant amount of people who are in the labor market as wage employees, whereas in rural areas, you may have more on-account workers, more informality, particularly in low and middle-income countries. So clearly, the reflection in a city may not necessarily be the reflection of what goes on in the rest of the country. What it is true is that if you have a city which concentrates a significant number of wage employees, and when we talk about the gender pay gap, we talk about wage employees, not necessarily about on-account workers, then of course that city may be very much representative of the full population of working age population in that country. That is usually probably the case. So for example, in the case of Japan, Tokyo, if you have data that is representative of Tokyo, probably gives you a very good indication of what is the gender pay gap in the rest of Japan on aggregate. But it's not necessarily the case that in rural areas in Japan, the gender pay gap is the same as in Tokyo.
Absolutely. And I guess we are looking at the formal employment, right? Not informal employment, which is what you would see more in the rural areas.
That is the case. But as I said, when we talk about the gender pay gap, we talk about comparing women and men's earning of women and men who work for someone else. Because if you work for yourself, if you're an own-account worker, and that's where informality is highly defined, then the gender pay gap is not something that we can, it's a decision that you make. It's not necessarily true that as an own-account worker, you have a much better work. You might have a lot of working deficits. But when we talk about the gender pay gap, we talk about wage employees. Now, wage employment can be formal and informal. And in both cases, when we estimate the gender pay gap, we take both formal and informal into account. What happens is that in countries where you have significant amounts of informality, it's the case that there is non-compliance with the minimum wage. And that means that you will have a much higher gender pay gap in these countries at the very low end, even if the country has some sort of system of minimum wages. For example, in the case of Mexico.
Yes, I'm just curious, where have you seen the gender pay gap has reduced the most in the last decade?
In the last decade, we would say that the gender pay gap has actually remained fairly constant across the world, in many countries across the world, in just about the majority of countries. The gender pay gap went substantially down in the beginning of the 1990s. And since the turn of the century, we can say that there has been very little change. And the reason why it changed in the 1990s is probably because there was a lot of incorporation of women in the labor market, and an increasing amount of women participating in occupations and sectors that were traditionally for men. But then what happened is that we arrived at the global financial crisis, which had a much bigger impact among men, because it was a crisis that impacted on sectors like trade, sectors like construction,
banking,
transportation, banking. And this is where men are more likely to occupy in terms of wage employment, and less in terms of women. Now we have arrived at the COVID pandemic, and the COVID pandemic has impacted more on women rather than men, because women occupy more type of jobs in things like hotels, accommodation, more that kind of presential jobs that you have women, where you have women who are far more likely to participate. So it may be the case that this time it has been the reverse impact compared to the global financial crisis, where the gender pay gap went down because men were more impacted than women. Now it could be the case that we have actually gone back a few years or maybe a decade in terms of reducing the gender pay gap as a result of COVID. But as I say, we still have to get the data. We also have to see how COVID evolves in the future, if it's now slowing down or it's picking up again. And then when, let's say, we go back to a steady state, the point where things are somehow comparable to a previous period and the crisis is over, we will be able to see with the data the extent to which this new crisis has impacted on gender inequalities, not just in terms of the gender pay gap, but in terms of gender participation, which has also an impact directly or indirectly on the gender pay gap.
Absolutely. And, we've seen this when it comes to cutting carbon emissions, or when it comes to other global issues where the developed countries are trying to see how they can help the developing nations. We've spoken of a few markets, Toronto, for instance, where inequalities are much lower than in other parts of the world. Do you think the governments can do something, the state governments or the city governments in these places, to help other countries from maybe where their companies are getting their, manufacturing done, or have their warehouses? Is there anything that can be done there?
Absolutely. I think one of the key ways in which the labor market works these days is the globalization process. And it is true that you have a lot of industries, multinationals, who are producing through the supply chain in countries like Bangladesh, India, etc. And in these countries, you could have these multinationals, maybe through the government actions or themselves, you could have them reducing the gender pay gap, because you have a lot of women who are participating in the supply chain. They are actually earning wages as a result of these multinationals. And the fact that these multinationals operate in governments, like you said, in Canada, or it could be any country in Europe, where the gender pay gap is an issue that is well in the policy agenda, these multinationals should be, and it would be very nice to see how they transfer such type of policies into their actions to reduce the gender pay gap in countries where they have most of the production done. That would be one way in which there is knowledge transfer and policy transfer at the global level to reduce the gender pay gap in countries where the gender pay gap is much substantial.
And I guess we will only see the impact of how the pandemic has affected working women in the next few years. When are you doing the next data collection drive around this?
Well, we are now working on the next Global Wage Report, which is a publication. It's one of the flagship publications of the ILO, and it comes out every 2 years. And the next one will be published at the end of 2022. And we should be able to see, with some estimates for some countries which have already got data, the extent to which the pandemic has impacted on gender inequalities, including the gender pay gap.